I'm John Burnham Schwartz, Literary Director of the Sun Valley Writers Conference, and this is Beyond the Page. In this episode, recorded live at the 2024 conference, biographer Jonathan Eig talks about his book on Martin Luther King Jr., the first major biography of the civil rights leader in decades. Eig resurrects King from myth and history and brings him to vivid life, with all of his emotional complexity and unwavering courage, drawing a fresh and indelible portrait of a man whom he justifiably calls one of America's founding fathers.
It's my honor to be here also to talk about this man, Martin Luther King. And I want to begin by describing the night of December 5th, 1955. On that night, as I say on the very beginning of my book, a black man, a young black man, 26 years old, became one of America's founding fathers. So what was happening on that night, December 5th? That was the first day of the Montgomery bus boycott. And I suspect we all know that Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on the bus, and that the people of Montgomery, the black community in Montgomery, had finally decided that enough was enough. And this was not a new idea. Riding buses in Montgomery, riding buses throughout the South for black people was a particularly humiliating form of degradation. It was something different. There were all kinds of forms of degradation in the Jim Crow South, but riding the buses was something special, something uniquely horrifying, because it was like a traveling theater where everybody got to see your humiliation, got to see the bus driver make you pay and get off and go in through the back door, made you, as Rosa Parks discovered, get up and give up your seat for a white passenger. And the community had been talking for years about doing something about this. Could they fight back? Could they refuse to stay off the buses? And if they did, would it make a difference? Could they change the attitudes of the white men who ran the town, not just the mayor and the police chief, but the people who ran the bus company, which happened to be white Northerners who owned that bus company? Could they do it? For one day, they had stayed off the buses. They had united, and they felt the power. We made them notice us. Could we stay off the buses for one more day? Could we stay off the buses all week, for a month? How? And they needed somebody to speak to the crowd, to the community that night, and to say, let's stay off the buses for at least one more day. And they looked around. The people who had organized this boycott were all the women, of course, of the black community in Montgomery, but they couldn't lead the movement because we were living in the even more sexist time than we live in now, and they needed a man who would be able to speak to the crowd that night. And there were some very experienced, established activists in the community, but they felt like if E.D. Nixon addressed the crowd, then some of Rufus Lewis's supporters wouldn't go along. And if Rufus Lewis spoke, they needed somebody new. And Joanne Robinson, who was really the person who had the idea for the boycott in the first place, said, well, my preacher's new in town. Nobody really dislikes him yet, and he's a pretty good speaker. Which is your preacher? Oh, his name is Martin Luther King. He was not Dr. King yet. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., the new pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, 26 years old. There he is, 26 years old. And he's asked, not will you become the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott, just will you speak to the crowd tonight? That's all he's asked to do. And his initial reaction when he gets the phone call is, in the immortal words of all of our great heroes, I don't know, let me think about it. He's really not interested in getting involved. He's got a 2-week-old baby at home. He's still getting used to his church. He's working on his doctoral dissertation. He just said no to joining the board of the NAACP in Alabama. So his initial reaction is, my plate's kind of full. But he thinks about it. And once he thinks about it, he realizes he has no choice. Everything in his life has brought him to this moment. He's a young black man from the South, raised in Atlanta. He's the son, grandson, and the great-grandson of preachers. He's been studying philosophy, nonviolence, and religion, has been to seminary, has been through graduate school, getting his doctorate at Boston University, and everything has been building in his mind to fighting for justice, for fighting for the idea in the Bible. And so much of King's life, so much of his activity, we forget, is rooted in the Bible. That if the Bible says all of us are made in God's image, then we have to not only believe that, we have to work to make it so. It's not just about praying. We have to work to make it so. So when he thinks about it, he says he has to go and speak to that crowd that night. By the time he gets this phone call, though, he's got 20 minutes to prepare. And this is a guy who usually takes about 8 hours to prepare his Sunday sermon. So he rushes home. He says to Coretta, I've got 20 minutes to prepare for the biggest speech of my life. And Coretta says, whatever you decide to do, you have my support. I can't come because of the baby. Take a tape recorder with you. And he runs back to his study to try to think about what to say. And for the first 10 minutes, he has a panic attack. A true panic attack. He can't breathe. He can't think. Finally gathers his thoughts. Ralph Abernathy's outside honking the horn. We got to go. And he rushes out the door. They get to the church, and there are thousands of people lining the streets. They can't even get into the church. The biggest church in town, Holt Street Baptist Church, is full. The janitors are putting up loudspeakers outside so that some of the people outside will be able to hear. And King, when Abernathy gets to as far as he can go, they can't reach the church, realizes this is for him. His panic attack comes back to him. He doesn't know what he's going to say. He doesn't know what he's going to do. He practically body surfs his way to the front of the church, to the pulpit, and he says that night the words that I believe made him a founding father right then, the words that would carry him for the rest of his life, and the words that we would come to understand as the Kingian philosophy. He said, it just may be that the black people of America are the ones who are going to teach this nation how to fulfill the promise of democracy, how to fulfill the empty words in the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. It just may be that the people who've been treated worst in this democracy are the ones who are going to show the way to fulfill its promise. And if we're wrong in demanding justice, then the Constitution is wrong. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, the Bible is wrong. God Almighty is wrong, and Jesus was just a man. And with those words, he finds this formula that is almost impossible to resist, and he becomes almost overnight a star. The white media descends on Montgomery to cover this boycott, and King becomes the spokesman. And they find that the northern media loves this story. Even some white Southerners have a hard time arguing, because what's he saying? I believe in the Bible. I believe in democracy. I'm not trying to tear down this country. I'm trying to make it better. We don't want to overthrow American government. We want to join it. And this message of hope, this message of optimism, this radical message of Christian love is what makes King a national symbol at the age of 26. The Montgomery bus boycott continues for 381 days. The people stay off of those buses until the city of Montgomery buckles. And King becomes someone we all over the country, people know and want to see what he's going to do next. Now, I wrote this book because in the process of King becoming this icon, this hero, in the process of becoming a national holiday and a national monument and 1,000 streets and more than 100 public schools, we've lost sight of the man. We've lost sight of the father. We've lost sight of the preacher. We've lost sight of the radical. We've lost sight of the man who struggled with mental health issues, who was hospitalized numerous times for depression. We've lost sight of the fact that our own government tried to destroy this man and used his weaknesses. We've lost sight of the fact that this is somebody who, when faced with the fact that his own government, the same government that now honors him with a national holiday, was trying to destroy him, only doubled down on his beliefs and insisted that he was going to not just fight for racial justice, but for the end to violence, materialism, and that not to do so would be hypocritical. So I wrote this book because I wanted readers to get to know King as a person again. I wanted to take advantage of the fact that people who knew him were still alive. For this book, I interviewed more than 200 people who knew Martin Luther King. When I told my kids that Martin Luther King's older sister was still alive, they were shocked. They couldn't believe it because they think of him as ancient history. So this was one of the great privileges, one of the great joys of my life. I knew even before I began the process of writing that just getting the chance to interview friends of Martin Luther King would be one of the great honors of my life. And in fact, to say one of King's closest childhood friends, June Dobbs Butts, became a dear friend to me. And during COVID, when she was in a nursing home, I called her every day. And the thought that I have a friend who was a friend of Martin Luther King just warms me in ways I can't even begin to explain. So this was a great journey. And you would think with someone as famous as Martin Luther King that there would be really very little new to be discovered. I mean, there are whole university departments dedicated to his study. But I found thousands of pages of new FBI documents that were just recently released, I found an unpublished memoir written by Martin Luther King's father. Hundreds of pages, including transcripts of interviews that he made while working on a book that was never published. I found tapes that Coretta Scott King made right after the assassination when she began thinking about writing her own book that nobody had heard before. Not even her family knew these tapes existed. And I found, maybe my favorite collection, Martin Luther King, I discovered, had an archivist. His name was Lawrence Dunbar Reddick. And he met King during the Montgomery bus boycott and stayed with him throughout his entire career, sadly only 13 years, but traveled with him, went to every mass meeting, and because he was a librarian, he wrote down everything, every song that was sung at every mass meeting. And his papers were at the Schomburg Center in Harlem. The boxes had never been opened. That to me is like, I don't know, striking oil, finding gold, I don't know. That's my favorite thing, unopened boxes. And this was, again, all toward the idea that we have a chance to get to know Martin Luther King again in a new way. In the beginning, how many people know Martin Luther King's name was not Martin Luther King when he was born? Maybe I hope those are all people who've read the book already. He was born Mike King, and his father, Mike King Sr., is one of the great stories in American history and makes it possible for us to have Martin Luther King Jr. Mike King is born into sharecropping. His parents were enslaved. He's working on the farm with his parents up to the age of about 14, sees what sharecropping has done to his parents, sees his father driven to drinking and violence, he's abusive, sees that his mother has maintained her faith, that she still goes to church every Sunday, still prays to God, and continues to have hope. But Mike King realizes that he's going to turn out just like his father if he doesn't do something. So at about the age of 13, he walks off the farm with his only pair of shoes tied over his shoulder and makes his way 20 miles from Stockbridge, Georgia to Atlanta. And in Atlanta, he goes to work in a railroad yard, shoveling coal, convincing people that he's older because he's a big, strong kid, and begins learning to preach and begins offering his services as an itinerant preacher, even though he's still basically illiterate. He also begins going to school, learning to read and write, and eventually marries into the family of a prominent preacher in Atlanta. His wife's father is the pastor at Ebenezer Church. So Mike King's friends would tease him like, "You didn't marry her for love, you married her to get your foot in the door of that church." And he said, well, maybe it was both. But he was a very ambitious guy. And Martin Luther King Jr. grows up with this enormous sense of ambition and with the sense, as I mentioned earlier, that preaching the Bible is not enough, that you have to act on it. You have to work in partnership with God to improve and shape the universe. And the black social gospel is a different thing from the white social gospel. There's much more emphasis on action. And Mike King, at the age of 5, remember, he's still Mike yet at this point, is so ambitious that he tries to sneak his way into kindergarten at age 4. And only when his teacher hears him talking about his birthday party does he get busted and sent home. Then he skips a couple of grades in school. He enters Morehouse at the age of 15 and graduates from Morehouse at the age of 18. And he's this short. People are always shocked when I tell people that King is the exact same height that I am, 5'7". And one of the things, the other joys of working on this book was interviewing people who knew King. And one of the first things they always say is, oh, he was really short. I interviewed like 5 or 6 women who dated him. And they always say the same thing. He was really short, but he had a car. But he had this ambition, this burning drive from a very early age. The South was run on fear. The main thing that kept black people from protesting as they were doing in Montgomery was fear. And when the Montgomery bus boycott began, membership in the White Citizens Council, which was the polite new version of the KKK, doubled overnight, doubled in the first week of the bus boycott, and continued to grow until the mayor and the police chief were members as well. And when their home was bombed, just weeks into the boycott, Coretta was home alone. And Martin's parents and Coretta's parents drove to the house that night and said, we're leaving. You're getting out of here. Someone else can take over from here. You do not need to be the target. And it was Coretta who spoke first and said, we're not going anywhere. So the Montgomery bus boycott elevates both of them to this position of national prominence and fame that they were not looking for. Remember, when the first phone call came, King's response was, I don't know if I want to get involved. But now, people all over the country are looking to King, looking to Montgomery, saying, how can we duplicate that? How can we do it again? How can we take this example and make it a national movement? And people from the North, like Bayard Rustin, are coming down. White radicals, former Communist Party members, are coming down to Montgomery and saying, we need to help you figure out how to make this a national movement. And King forms the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in the idea that we can spread this around the country. And it doesn't go that well, to be honest. For the first year or two, they fail miserably. And it's really important to remember that King fails over and over again throughout his career. And it's not until here in Birmingham in 1963 that we really see King capturing the national spotlight all to himself again. And why is that? It's because John F. Kennedy has not yet delivered on his promise to King and to other civil rights leaders that he's going to introduce meaningful civil rights legislation. Kennedy is afraid that he's going to lose votes in the South. And King is reminding him over and over again, you would not be in office without our votes. You owe us. And King writes and prepares a second Emancipation Proclamation, delivers it to Kennedy, and still Kennedy is stalling, saying, be patient, I'll get to it. And King is saying, no, not going to be patient. One of the people who was with King in Birmingham, and one of the people I interviewed, Reverend Bernard Lafayette, said, Martin was the greatest crowbar America ever invented. He saw his job as just prying, putting pressure until the crack opened up and others could come and help to lift. And here he is in Montgomery saying, we are not going to wait for Kennedy to deliver civil rights legislation. We are going to demand it. And he brings this movement to Birmingham, boycotting businesses, marching through the streets, thousands of people getting arrested, so many that the movement is really running out of steam. And even a lot of the black preachers in Montgomery are saying, you know, Dr. King, we may have bitten off more than we can chew here. Bull Connor is a wily adversary. And King finally decides, because he's running out of people to put in jail, that he's going to involve teenagers, high school students, even junior high school students, to come and march and to get arrested. And Malcolm X, when he hears this, says, even I wouldn't do that. King says, we have to do it. And that's when the tide begins to turn. And some of it begins to turn because of the media. And JFK finally says, okay, we will introduce the legislation. And King and Bayard Rustin and other civil rights leaders like Roy Wilkins and A. Philip Randolph helped to start shaping this what becomes one of the most important bills in American history. But even so, when Kennedy agrees to to put forth this legislation, King is not content. He's worried that it's going to take too long. He's worried that the bill is going to get watered down, that it's going to get stalled in Congress. So he begins planning for the March on Washington. And Kennedy is begging him not to do it. Why, you might ask? Because now we think of the March on Washington as this great peaceful protest, but because any time black people had appeared on television or newspapers up until that point in a public gathering, in a protest of any kind, it had ended in violence. And Kennedy was afraid that if the March on Washington ended in violence, it would destroy any chance of getting that bill through, the Civil Rights Act. King insists. In fact, they move up the date to put more pressure on. And 250,000 people gather that day. People all over the country, all over the world were feeling this kind of a different love and a kind of hope for what America could be. People began to think that this country could be different, that we might finally be done with this stain, with this original sin of racism. And all over the country, I talked to people who began to integrate their factories immediately after seeing King on TV. But something else happened the next day, August 29th, 1963. The next day, FBI Assistant Director William Sullivan wrote a note to his boss, J. Edgar Hoover, that said, given King's speech yesterday, the March on Washington, we must now rank him, if we have not already done so, as the most dangerous man in America when it comes to race. I want to let that sink in for a second. Why would the FBI consider King dangerous as a result of this speech? He's not Malcolm X. He's not threatening violence. I think it's because he represented a serious, undeniable threat to the status quo. And that for hundreds of years, the power structure had been unchanged, and it had been working out pretty well for those who had the power. And perhaps J. Edgar Hoover was right in recognizing that King posed a threat to that. So if you see your job as being protecting the status quo, then yes, you might see King as a threat. So they authorized wiretaps on his home, on his office, on the homes and offices of some of his closest associates. And they began those wiretaps with the concern that he might be associating with members of the Communist Party of America. They quickly realized he wasn't. And some FBI officials recommended that they turn off the wiretaps. But by then, they had also heard King on the phone with women, other than Coretta. And J. Edgar Hoover recognized that that was something he could use to damage King. And that if you see King as a threat to the status quo and you want him out, you could destroy his reputation. They began leaking tapes of King's hotel room activities to members of the media. They made a tape, a compilation from some of his hotel rooms, and sent it to his home in the hopes that his wife would listen, with a note to King saying, "You are going to be exposed as a fraud. The only way out for you is suicide." Our government, the same government that honors him today with a national holiday. And King knew this was going on. He knew he was under surveillance. He knew the government was trying to destroy him, undermine his work. And what did he do? He continued. He continued to speak out more and more aggressively, more and more radically. He began to say that, it's not enough to complain about segregation in the Jim Crow South. It's not enough to fight for voting rights. The North is just as racist as the South. He was actually saying it all along. We just didn't begin to notice it. We didn't begin to listen to it until 1966 or so when he moved to Chicago, my town, where I'm embarrassed to say King was treated perhaps even worse than he was treated in Birmingham. Moved in to North Lawndale in Chicago and marched, was hit in the back of the head with stones, left Chicago saying that the people of Chicago could teach Birmingham a thing or two about hate. And yet, he continues, the northern media is not interested in these stories. It's much easier to write about southern racism when you're working for the New York Times than it is to write about northern racism. And King continues, knowing that he's becoming less popular. The more he speaks out on the Vietnam War, the more he infuriates LBJ. And I should mention another important archival find. J. Edgar Hoover was sending personal letters to President Johnson, sometimes 3 a week, about King's activity. LBJ was keeping them in his safe. I found them in his secretary's files, again, that had never been open to the public before. They were declassified at my request. And what they show is that LBJ was complicit, that he was not only authorizing and reauthorizing these wiretaps, but that he was encouraging the FBI to release this material to the press. At the same time, he's on the phone with King, saying, "Can you help me put out these fires in Watts?" The duplicity is astounding. And the more King speaks out in Vietnam, the more he angers LBJ. And what does he do? I want to show the fatigue setting in, the feeling that nobody's really listening to him anymore. By 1967, 2/3 of Americans say they disapprove of Martin Luther King. Not that they disapprove of his stance on Vietnam, not that they disapprove of his activities in Chicago, they disapprove of Martin Luther King. 2/3 of all Americans. And yet he continues. He begins planning what he calls his most audacious campaign, his most ambitious campaign. He's going to plan what he calls the Poor People's Campaign. It's basically Occupy Washington, D.C. He's going to bring thousands of people to a tent city in Washington opposite the Capitol, and they're going to shut down the government until this country agrees to fundamental changes in how the economy works. Guaranteed jobs, guaranteed income, guaranteed Head Start programs for kids. And this makes him even more popular. The FBI releases a memo in early 1968 saying, the Poor People's Campaign, by now Malcolm X is dead, as the FBI acknowledges. King is the only one left who could become the Black Messiah and lead a revolution, according to the FBI. And King gives that year what I consider his greatest speech, the Beyond Vietnam speech, where he says he would be a hypocrite. He would be defying all of his values, everything he's been saying since he began his career, reluctantly, with the Montgomery bus boycott. He would be a hypocrite if he did not speak out against things like materialism and militarism. He could not speak out against the rioting in American cities without pointing out that the greatest purveyor of violence on earth is the United States government in Vietnam. And after that speech, every newspaper in the country pillories him and says that he doesn't know what he's talking about. Never mind that he has a Nobel Peace Prize. He should stick to his lane, talk about what he knows about, talk about the South. And his popularity plummets even further. While he's planning the Poor People's Campaign, and it's not going well, he's asked to come to Memphis. And King's advisors are saying, you can't go to Memphis right now. We're planning for the Poor People's Campaign. We need thousands of people to show up for this thing, and we've only got 30 people signed up. And King says, I have to go to Memphis. These are the people we're talking about. These are the people who I'm preaching for. And he always said that his activism was just an extension of his ministry. These are the people I'm trying to minister to. And he began to see the nation and the world as his ministry. And he had to go to Memphis, he said. So he goes. And it doesn't go well the first time. The first march ends in violence, and he feels absolutely committed that he must come back and prove. The press is saying now that Martin Luther King is losing his hold on the nation. He can't even organize a nonviolent protest anymore. And after that first march, which ends so badly, he calls one of his best friends. And his friend says, I think maybe you should just scale back. That speech that you gave about Vietnam was a disaster. It really hurt us. And we know exactly what King said in response to this friend who he'd known for more than a decade. We know because the FBI was recording the call and we have the transcript. King said, "Don't you know me? Don't you know who I am? What I'm doing may be politically unwise, but it is not morally unwise." So he goes back to Memphis and he makes a speech, the last speech of his life. He wasn't supposed to speak that night. He was sick, he was in bed. And Ralph Abernathy called and said, "You've got to come down here. They don't want to hear from me." Thousands of people were gathered at Mason Temple. Pouring rain, thunder and lightning. And King goes to Mason Temple and gives a speech really unlike any he'd ever given before. He summarizes his whole life. He talks about the fact that when he began in Montgomery, he was reluctant to get involved. He talks about the fact that his home was bombed, his house has been shot at, he was stabbed in the chest. And he says that when he was stabbed in the chest, the doctors told him if he'd sneezed, that he would have died. And a young woman wrote to him and said, "I'm glad you didn't sneeze." And King says that night, "I'm glad I didn't sneeze too, because if I could have lived through any time in the whole history of the world, the Renaissance, the Golden Age, anything, I would have chosen this time right now when our people have risen up and said, we're not going to take it anymore. When our people have risen up and said, we can show a better way. And I believe that our people will reach the promised land. I may not get there with you. A long life is a blessing, but that doesn't matter for me anymore. I just want to do God's will." And the next day, he's standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. He's joking with Abernathy about what they're going to have for dinner. They're going to Reverend Billy Kyle's house, and Reverend Kyle's wife is a fabulous cook. And King's getting ready to go, and he looks down the balcony, and his driver's in the parking lot, and says, "Doc, it's getting kind of chilly. You might want to go back in and get a jacket." And King says, "Okay, I will." When I wrote that scene in the book, I honestly didn't notice that his last words were, "Okay, I will," because he turned to go back to his room to get his jacket. And that's when the bullet rang out and shot him. He died almost instantly. And when I think about those last words, when I think about the world we're living in today, I think about how hopeless it seems sometimes when even the strides that King made, the accomplishments that he logged that we thought were ours to treasure forever, voting rights, civil rights, when we thought those things were secured and they're still under attack, it might seem hopeless. When we see democracy on wobbly legs, things might seem hopeless. When temperatures are rising and we feel like we can do nothing about it, I think of those words, and I think that if King, after all he went through, after all he sacrificed, after all he doubled down on his beliefs over and over again, that if he could continue to say, "Okay, I will," then we can too. So, thank you.
Thanks for listening to Beyond the Page. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating or review. A good one, we hope. To catch all the latest from the Sun Valley Writers Conference, be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to listen to this conversation in its entirety, or to any of our other talks, you can find them at svwc.com. I'm John Burnham Schwartz. Until next time.